Is it real or is it fantasy? I'll tell you how it's a little bit of both, and I'll do it today on Locked On Jaguars.
You are Locked On Jags, your daily Jacksonville Jaguars podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Thank you guys for joining me again for another edition of Locked On Jaguars, your daily or 3 times weekly right now during the month of June Jaguars podcast, where it's your team every day. I'm your host, Tony Wiggins, here giving you the Jaguars content you crave on all platforms, and it's free. You can find us on YouTube and everywhere else where you get your platforms, and it is free. Today's episode is brought to you by Blue Nile. Make your moment sparkle with jewelry from BlueNile.com. And Locked On Jaguars listeners get $50 off purchases of $500 or more. This podcast includes exclusive engagement from Blue Nile. So make sure you use the promo code Locked On at checkout. I want to talk a little bit about the connection between fantasy football and real football. Real football, that means the game's actually being played on the field, as well as what impact one has on the other. Now, the fantasy football has zero impact on whether or not a team wins a game or not. Case in point, 2 years ago, James Robinson was one of the best fantasy backs in the league, and the Jaguars had the worst record in the league. So for the sake of housekeeping, we're going to make sure that we point that out, that we understand that. And there are a lot of people that draw a hard line between fantasy football and real football, and they don't commingle the two. There are many people that don't believe how or believe in the fact or don't understand how you could actually mix fantasy football and real football. If you have a fantasy football player on a team that's actually playing against your team that you root for and that you call your home team, how can you want him to be successful and then want your team to win? How could you root for him to score touchdowns, but at the same time rooting for your team to beat the guy that you have on your fantasy team? Look, I totally get it, and I totally understand, and I am not naive that there is a bit of a conundrum when you try to figure out how you're going to be able to do both of those things. It's almost like hustling backwards. But we have managed the fantasy football community and the football community, and guys like me that have blended both things together. We have actually managed to find a way to do that. And I'm going to talk to you today about that with the Jaguars. I'll talk to you about how it doesn't necessarily mean that there's on-field success. What it means is that a lot of times you're dialed into the identity of your team, and you know how the game is going to go and how the game is going to flow. I'll give you examples of that. I'll also talk to you about guys that I think will have a big year for the Jaguars offensively, because when we think fantasy football, we think offense first. But there are some dynasty leagues where they do actually, or other leagues where they just pick defensive players, and we'll talk about some of those guys too. And then in segment 3, guys that'll have a quiet impact on this team and why, and we'll tie that all into the fantasy football. But back to this fantasy football thing with the Jacksonville Jaguars. One of the things that has been a tell with how bad this team has been the lack of depth when you go into fantasy. How many Jaguars are chosen for these other teams? Now, you're wondering like how and what. If you're not a fantasy football player, you might learn a little bit today. So don't bail on me. How does that have any indication or give any indication of what has gone on with the team? Well, I'll tell you why. When you've watched Jacksonville the last few years, the one thing that we've always talked about is they did not have an identity. You don't know what to expect from week to week. A person that is really, really adept at fantasy football and understands fantasy football knows that when you have that kind of situation, those are teams and players that you stay away from, because what you're trying to do is identify guys that are going to have success based on the performances that you've seen and based on the consistency and the continuity of what's going on with the team. When you've had a coach in the past that has said that we're just going to throw blank against the wall and see what happens, and then Urban Meyer running last year had guys running in here. If they ever ran track anywhere, they were going to be the number one receiver, and we're going to just throw 9 routes to them every single time. when you don't have an identity and you have coaches that do stuff like that, and that was Doug Marrone who was doing the first, and they're reaching every single week trying to figure out what's going on, then you as a fantasy football connoisseur had a hard time figuring out what was going to happen and who was going to be in the lineup. But when you have teams that have identities, when even with teams that get out front, that get ahead, you know what they're going to do. With teams, I'll give you a perfect example. If a team is behind all the time, that means they're going to throw it a lot. And that means that teams that they're playing against are either going to be blitzing or they're going to pin their ears back, or they're just going to sit there in the fourth quarter and let them dink and dunk. Then the running back, who is the recipient of all of those dink and dunks and checkdowns, becomes a hit in fantasy football because he catches a lot of balls. He gets a lot of yards after the catch. So the yards count and the catches count in a PPR league. That's that's points per reception. And you can make a killing with a guy like that being just, say, your third running back or your flex position. Because in fantasy, if you don't know, there's a quarterback, there's two running backs, there's two receivers, a tight end, and then a flex position who could be a running back, tight end, or a wide receiver on your offense. And you get points for every single catch and every single yard, and then obviously every single touchdown that these guys make. So you can pick guys off of a bad team. One of the best fantasy football players last year was Cordell Patterson, because you knew that they were going to force feed him the ball. He was going to get tons of opportunities, and then he had the potential to make big plays. And then he did not come out in the red zone, so he scored a lot of touchdowns. So you could actually get players from a bad team, and I mentioned James Robinson before, who actually benefit you in fantasy football. But what you won't find are the guys behind them, and you won't find is the second and third receiver, and you won't find the tight end or the quarterback getting much love and much play in fantasy football, simply because teams don't know what to expect. And 9 times out of 10, the secondary players won't get very many opportunities because the team is bad and they're losing. So we'll talk in this episode who can have a big impact, how that can be an indication of what is going on, good or bad, with the team, and then guys who have a quiet impact. And I'm gonna give you a little bit. I'm not gonna try to sit here and tease you to death. I think the Jaguars are gonna have more guys this year. Have better opportunities and to be selected for fantasy football. I'm gonna do you guys a favor. I'm gonna tell you who those guys are and how they'll have an impact. And hopefully, even if you're not a fantasy football fan, you'll understand why I'm starting to believe that there's a legitimate shot that this team will be improved, and they'll be improved based on not because of, but an indicator of how much they'll be improved uh, will be noted in the fact that they'll get more play for fantasy football. So we'll discuss all of that here as we move along on this episode of Locked On Jaguars. After I tell you guys about Blue Nile. Blue Nile is all about sending a message, and the message is you want your special occasions marked with custom jewelry that you made yourself, jewelry that you picked out, that you had 24-hour access to whoever was designing it, and you can only get that at BlueNile.com. Now, all of these occasions are coming up. Mother's Day, anniversary. Mother's Day just went by. Father's Day. There's always a wedding anniversary. There's always something for you to celebrate, especially with that special person in your life, and you can do that at BlueNile.com. It's simple. Online tools that let you choose the diamond shape, size, and clarity, as well as setting size. Blue Nile's bench jewelers will then handcraft her perfect engagement ring. Each ring is one of a kind. All right, what you need to do is make sure you go to BlueNile.com and use the promo code Locked On, and Locked On Jaguars listeners will get $50 off purchases of $500 or more. Every order is insured, ships free, and arrives in discreet packaging that won't give away what's inside, so you can surprise the special person in your life. Shop stress-free and find your forever piece at BlueNile.com. Make sure you use the promo code Locked On at checkout. Are we rolling along here, man, on Locked On Jaguars and talking fantasy football and its connection to whether or not that indicates whether the team's going to be better, and whether or not, if you look at it the other way, if a better team means more action and more play on fantasy football, which, by the way, has sort of a secondary effect on the team as a whole, from as far as perception wise, and I'll touch on that in just 1 second. The NBA mock draft is coming up, and you guys need to participate in the Ultimate NBA mock draft, which starts June 16th with over 50 insiders. Nothing equals the Ultimate NBA mock draft. You can bet on that. The Locked On NBA Big Board Draft experts plus the Odyssey insiders. First pick is June 16th. Uh, June 16th is where it's at. So you need to search Ultimate NBA Mock Draft and follow now so you don't miss a pick. All right. So how can fantasy football and more guys, the team being better, in impact fantasy football, and how on earth is that is important to the Jaguars as a whole? Okay. On the field, nothing. The fantasy football does not affect anything on the field. Like, it's not going to impact the game. It's the other way around. The game impacts fantasy football. So if the Jaguars are playing better on the field 9 times out of 10, that means they have more of an identity and something that people can hang their hat on. That means that they're halfway there. You got to still win the games, but you're halfway there when you know who you are and what you are, and you have an identity and a way that you like to play, and you're going to come out and that's what you're going to do. So if you name all the top teams in the league, and I can sit here and say, okay, draw me a script, what are they going to do every single week? You already know what it is. So the Jaguars, when they start doing that, that means that they'll have more success. If you have some success, you're more likely to stick with something, and you'll keep doing it over and over again. And if you're doing it over and over again, that means that you like it and it's working, but you just might probably need to tweak it and continue to stay with it. And you're going to keep doing that thing over and over again, because nobody keeps doing the same thing. Well, most of the time, people don't keep doing the same things over and over and getting the same bad result, because that's the definition of insanity. However, if the Jaguars are doing the same things over and over again every single week, that's because they're probably thinking that it's working. And now what happens is, in fantasy football, you start to get a clue as to who's going to be what and how reliable they're going to be, proactively, not reactively. So now you're picking guys, and then by you picking guys, you'll probably have an idea of the depth guys that are going to be able to play a little bit more. If the team is able to stay on the field offensively, that gives more guys on that offense the ability to make plays and make an impact and have the ball in their hands, especially when, if you're controlling the ball, you're going to give your guys on offense a little bit of a blow. And now the second running back comes in and he makes an impact. So if that happens, what it means is more touches for more people. How does it impact the perception of the Jaguars overall? I'll tell you how it impacts them. The more touches for more people, the more familiarity people who don't follow your team every single day has with the guys on the team. And when those guys, those people through fantasy football, have an expectation of backups, and they have an expectation, or they have a familiarity with guys that are depth guys, more so, like if you ask a Jaguar fan, the Jaguar fans right now can name you the best 53, the most likely 53 to make the team, and then leave out about 10 guys that they also know. National guys and people around that aren't Jacksonville fans don't do that. They wouldn't do that. They won't do that any more than you can look at the team in Minnesota and name their top 53 right now. You probably can't, unless you're a heavy fantasy football fan or a Minnesota Viking fan. So the point is the more familiarity that comes with those guys, that means people will start now to recognize that the Jaguars have more than one or two recognizable players, because people often forget about players on bad teams. And then what happens is it starts to build up towards, okay, they're pretty good because they got this guy, this guy, this guy, and this guy. And the more guys you know off of those teams, that means the perception is that you're giving them a better chance of winning, and the narratives about them start to change. It doesn't mean anything on the field. The impact has to happen on the field first. But when the impact happens on the field, then all of these off the field things happen. And now people start really getting to know who these guys are. It's a shame that more people don't know how good Fred Taylor was. It's a shame that more people don't know exactly how good Jimmy Smith was, because if they did, those guys would be really knocking down the door of the Hall of Fame and get more traction to getting in. But the reason why is because the team itself wasn't good enough for a longer period of time, that anyone who wasn't around here locally, or anyone who wasn't in the AFC South or in the AFC Central when they first started, no one really understands how good they were. And it takes former players sometimes that played against them to tell people. It takes a guy like Ryan Clark. As much as I love Ryan Clark was not as good a safety as Fred Taylor was a running back. So it's always Ryan Clark constantly on the Pivot podcast telling people how much of a dog and how good Fred was, because the team success had a lot more impact on the notoriety of the players on the team. So who do I think will have the biggest impact on the team? The first guy that jumps to mind for me is Travis Etienne. He has a pop. He has some pop. When you watch him, I mentioned the usage of Bryant Westbrook in the past as a guy who Travis could probably you could expect from a touch perspective. I know guys like to talk about people like Alvin Kamara, but I don't know if they're really running that same offense as New Orleans. But I will go back to the Andy Reid offenses that Doug Peterson has been a part of, and I'll tell you right now, Bryant Westbrook had a huge. You go back and look at some of those games and some of those years and the statistics where, and I knew firsthand because I rooted for the team in Washington for years, and Bryant Westbrook was destroying them. Screens, handoffs, draw plays, sprint draws, direct snaps, whatever you want to call it. Travis Etienne has the body type, and then he doesn't come out on third downs because he is a powerful dude at about 215 pounds. So I think Travis Etienne, being a number one pick, being a guy, and with James Robinson sort of coming back from injury, I think Travis Etienne is going to be a guy that's going to get a bunch of touches every single drive. Not the same way, because people have a tendency to do this. Everyone wants to talk about Deebo Samuel. Not quite the same way, but similar to the point where he's an explosive guy, maybe the most explosive guy on the offense and on the field, and you want to continue to get him the ball to put pressure on the team, and you can get him in the ball in a number of ways. So I think right off the bat, Travis Etienne is the guy that will have a huge impact in fantasy football. Christian Kirk, because of what they paid him and because of his ability also, and the rapport that he is building with Trevor Lawrence through these mini camps, I think Christian Kirk is another guy who's going to get some chances at fantasy. He's the guy, in my opinion, on this team most likely to have a pass play that is designed to get him the ball 30, 40 yards down the field, because I think he's really, really fast, and he's also super explosive. And once he catches the ball, he turns into a punt returner. So Christian Kirk is another guy that I think will have a good year. Trevor Lawrence will have a good fantasy football year. He may not be quarterback one to a lot of people, but I do believe Trevor Lawrence has a chance to be that second quarterback, or be that guy, if the matchup is right, that people are going to use him. Why? Because I think his completion percentage is going to go up. I think he has more weapons and more outlets to throw the ball to, and guys who can really, really separate. And then Trevor Lawrence also has something else that really, really helps you in fantasy football: legs. Trevor Lawrence can run. Trevor Lawrence will get out of dodge on you in a heartbeat, and will occasionally even score a touchdown if he gets down into the red zone. But he just extends drives, even if it means him just scrambling and running out of bounds after pump faking. Those yards mean a lot to a quarterback, because a lot of quarterbacks don't get any rushing yards. And when you can pad your stats with about 30 rushing yards and potentially a touchdown, that's anywhere between 3 and 9 points for whoever has him on his team. And plus, you can run, extend plays, get into scramble routes, complete more passes, and even touchdowns, especially in the red zone. So a guy with legs also has a chance to really, really help in fantasy football. And I think those three guys will do the trick for Jacksonville. All right, I'll tell you the impact of some more guys possibly in fantasy football, as well as some defensive guys that if you play in those leagues, they use defensive players who will help you. And one or two people that'll have a quiet impact on this football team, a quiet impact where they make other people's better, even though they may not get a bunch of credit for it. I'll do all of that in segment 3 here on Locked On Jaguars, after I tell you about Built Bar and the Built Bar Mud Pie. You know how our friends at Built Bar are always coming out with amazing new flavors. Well, this time Built has truly outdone themselves with their new mud pie flavor. And for the first time ever, Built is introducing a new mud pie flavor in both the mud pie Built Bar and the mud pie puff. That's right. You know, the puff is a protein infused marshmallow. It has a little bit of a different texture than the Built Bar, which is more rectangular. The puff is almost shaped like a football. It's sort of oval. It's soft and gooey, but both are absolutely delicious, and they have the same macros, and they give you the same nutritional value. And of course, the great Built Bar quality and the great taste. They don't bleed and leak all over your hands. They are in these exquisite packages that really, really keep them fresh, and they make everyone want to ask you for them. So if you want to know about those mud pie, Built Bars. Go to built.com and use the promo code LOCK15 and you'll get 15% off your order. Now, you can get an assorted box or you can try different flavors. I go ahead and try that mud pie because I tried it and it is absolutely delicious. You know, my favorite is salted caramel, but they also have chocolate mousse, whipped cream, cookies and cream crumble. Stop drooling, man. Get to built.com to order your box of mud pie, bars, and puffs. Now you will not regret it. It's Built Bar at built.com. Promo code is locked15 for 15% off. And check them out at Twitter at @bar_built for all the latest information and news on Built Bar. All right, man, we're rolling along here on Locked On Jaguars. I'm Tony Wiggins once again, thanking you for making us your first listen every single day. We are absolutely grateful for you doing that. The Locked On NFL podcast is also out there rolling along, and you guys can check it out, man, because I was on there yesterday with James Rapine. We had a really, really good show, but it's Monday through Friday with hosts from all over the Locked On NFL network, and they give it to you like you can't get it anywhere else, man. Different perspectives, but the same quality, same great entertainment value, and of course, the latest information of all the news around the NFL from the Locked On NFL crew. Make sure you like and subscribe to that podcast. Make it your next listen after your first listen here on Locked On Jaguars. And it's free on all platforms as well. Check out the YouTube page, please. The impact. We're talking about fantasy football and trying to draw a connection between the success of the team on the field and how it impacts fantasy football, and then the residual effects of having fantasy football kind of affect the perception of what the Jaguars can and will be this season. There's some quiet impact guys that I'm going to get to in just a second. Guys that won't get a lot of credit statistically that'll actually make this team a lot better. And we'll talk about those at the end of this segment. But we're going to get back to some more of these guys who can have an impact in fantasy football. Some of you guys, you know, some of us have leagues where we use defensive players in fantasy. If you don't play fantasy, you can use defensive players. There are dynasty leagues where you keep the same team year after year, but you just keep adding to it via the draft and making trades. That makes you feel more like a general manager. It takes you a little bit longer to get better in those leagues because just like the NFL, it takes time to build it. But you pick early every year, and hopefully you get the first pick in free agency. So there'll be some guys that'll be available for you. I'm going to give you some guys. I know these cats are already accounted for. Some of them are. Foye Oluwakan is going to be huge for Jacksonville because he led the league in tackles last year. And see, this is what I talk about with stats and things that don't necessarily tell you the full story. Foye Oluwakan led the league in tackles last year, and Atlanta was not a good football team. But the reason why he was able to lead the league in tackles, because they weren't a good football team. They weren't a good football team because they didn't have the ball all the time. When you don't have the ball all the time and you're behind, teams run the ball to run the clock out. When teams run the ball to run the clock out, linebackers who can make tackles are the guys who get all of the statistics defensively. That's how fantasy football works. You get an idea of the flow of the game, and you understand how the game is going to go and how the game is going to be played and who's going to be the one not to necessarily impact the game, but the guy who will be impacted personally more about where the game flows. And you take that guy and you put him on your team in fantasy football. The Jaguars will probably have to be ahead and probably have some games where they get ahead for this next guy to have the huge impact that I expect. But if they get ahead, that means that Josh Allen gets to peel his ears back a little bit and go after the passer, because when you're ahead and the other team is behind, they're trying to play catch up, especially in the second half, because they ain't got all day to continue to run the football and stick to their game plan. So now I think Josh Allen gets turned loose a little bit because I think the presence, one, the system will change, but two, the presence of having another guy on the other side of the field who teams have to worry about in Trayvon Walker will help Josh Allen. I'll give Josh a statistical advantage here because he's been in the NFL and he has less things to get used to and less looks that he has to start to be able to decipher and figure out what he wants to do. And he probably will have more of a comfort level because this is his fourth year on how things should go. So he'll adapt a little bit quicker than Trayvon. And I think Josh Allen will have a big year. I think Devin Lloyd, too, will have a big year because just like the running backs that have a quick seamless adjustment sometimes to the NFL. I think running hit linebackers do the same thing. Off the ball linebackers who play in space, who play behind big defensive tackles, they have to do what they've always done. They have to find, see, and hit. And I think Devin Lloyd has the physical ability to do that. He also has this knack for being Johnny on the spot in terms of getting uh, fumbles, tip balls. He had a lot of interceptions. Just being Johnny on the spot. He has long, long arms, and he does not sacrifice girth because he has that additional length. So we talked about the profile change of the Jaguars team. And when you look back at the way Mike Caldwell was the staff that he was on in Tampa and how they coached, the linebackers had a lot to do with all of the action, and they made a lot of plays and got their hands on the ball. So look for those two linebackers to have an impact, including Devin Lloyd as a rookie, who people can get in the dynasty drafts. Quiet impact guys on this football team, guys that you probably won't select for fantasy football, but will make the guys around them better. One is Brandon Sheriff. He's a former All-Pro, been around, seen everything. He absolutely fills in a hole at right guard that has been needing to be filled for a long, long time. And he's going to be really, really necessary now that they're going with a newer, younger center, whether it be Luke Fortner or putting Tyler Shatley in that role. They're going to need to keep people off of Trevor, and you need the teams they've developed a way to not only rush the quarterback from the outside, but to knock a young guy off his square by blitzing him up the middle. And the better you are and the more fortified you are in the middle of your offensive line, the better the team will be, and the more opportunities Trevor will have to remain in the pocket and hit some of these weapons. So I think Brandon Sheriff has a huge impact without probably getting a lot of credit. Because he'll probably make Trevor Lawrence feel more and more comfortable, especially since Brandon Linder has now moved on to retirement. Darius Williams is another player that I believe impacts this team because his presence at corner. He said he can play in the slot, he'll play outside, and I totally believe him. I think he's going to end up in the slot because they're in nickel 70% of the time, most of the time in the NFL. It's going to be interesting to see how the Jaguars do that, though, because it's easier to do that from a 4-3 base because you can go 4-2-5. But if you're running a 3-4, that means you're going to get rid of one of your interior linemen. I don't think they're going to take one of their middle two linebackers off the field because the two outside linebackers are both your edge rush guys and they're your two best players on the team. So what I think you might end up seeing the Jaguars do to get into nickel more, instead of taking out one of those linebackers like more the traditional 4-3 teams do, you'll see the Jaguars take out one of the run stuffers. So they need to get into this. They need to get into their good down at their positive down the distance. They need to get into it a lot earlier. To be able to get to the set that puts their best 11 players on the field. So you start out early. If you can get them in 2nd and 7 or longer, you go immediately to your nickel and probably remove one of those run defense guys. But that's also why you want to play from ahead, because the more you play from ahead, I do believe the Jaguars' best 11 players is with one of the run stuffers. In this case, I think it will be Malcolm Brown. I think you leave Devon Hamilton in the game, of course, Roy Robinson Harris or Arden Key, whoever's going to play that position. But then this is where I think you start to see Trayvon Walker with his hand on the ground a little bit, playing that end position to go along with those other three guys, with Josh Allen being the fourth guy outside, depending on which side the tight end rolls to. And then the two Mike linebackers or the inside linebackers, the backer position, as well as I think they call it the monster or something like that. But that's when you'll see the third corner come in and he'll be inserted along with the two safeties that are already in the game. So very, very interesting. You could have some situations too where they leave the front alone and they take one of the safeties out, the strong safety out, and they leave maybe Andre Cisco or somebody as a single high, and then you have the two corners with the same front. So it's a lot of ways that they can do it. But that versatility alone and the fact that I'm even speaking of it this way tells you that Darius Williams, and if one of the corners get hurt and they put Darius Williams outside, they can go to another corner or bring in a third safety and go to what is called a big nickel. So he'll have an impact just based on his experience, not only his ability, but the fact that he allows them to have the sort of versatility that can get the other team off the field and put the other team at an advantage and not have to sacrifice anything on their side of the ball. So those are some things that fantasy football and some of the guys on the team who can have an impact. We hope you enjoyed the show today. We'll hit you up again tomorrow in what is a little bit of an off season. So my third podcast will be tomorrow on a Friday. And you guys have some things to look forward to. I want to talk about the scheme and how the scheme offensively and defensively will make this team a little bit different, as well as who can benefit the most from this scheme. Now, we're going to have some obvious people, but then there are going to be a few people that aren't that obvious to you that I think can help this football team. And you guys know this Jaguar team in the past has needed as much help as they can get from the stars and the guys behind them. So I know you guys love taking a deep dive into some of the extra names that could help this team. And we're going to talk about schematically who those guys can be. And we'll do it on the next episode here, Locked On Jaguars. Until then, you guys make sure you do what I always tell you to do, and that's take care of each other. Find something to be nice about, man, and we'll see you here on Locked On Jaguars.